Morally, I think we should stop things from happening that are unjust. But if it's happening anyway, the inner chatter is it is through the injustice and the suffering that I am experiencing that nature is now becoming aware that these things can happen in nature. It is through my sacrifice that nature evolves, that nature gains insight into what it is doing to itself. That's my role. My role is that of a sacrificial life. It's that of being a metacognitive spy for nature. Is that of telling God what it means to be a human being suffering in this world. Because without that, God doesn't know. That's what the book of Job is all about, right? God doesn't know what he or she or they or it is doing to Job. Job has to go and confront God with the reality of injustice for God to evolve and become more metacognitively aware of what it is doing to its creation. In other words, to what it's doing to itself. That's the role of a sacrificial life. And if we understand that, our inner chatter changes fundamentally and we add less meta suffering, unnecessary suffering, to the suffering that is already naturally intrinsic to life. We don't torture ourselves in addition to life already torturing us.
Mm. Bernardo Kastrup is an author with 2 PhDs in philosophy and computer science, who previously worked at CERN and is best known for his promotion of analytic idealism, which posits that reality is fundamentally mental or consciousness-based rather than material. We'll discuss Jung, Schopenhauer, and the meaning of life itself. Please like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, Bernardo, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you. It's such a pleasure to have you on. You're probably the most requested guest I get from my audience, at the top of the list. So I know many people are already familiar with your work, but I was thinking we have so much to cover, and we're going to dive into decoding Jung's metaphysics in a moment. But first, especially for folks who are unfamiliar with your work, could you share a high level explanation of what analytic idealism is?
It's a metaphysical hypothesis, meaning it's a hypothesis about what nature is, as opposed to how nature behaves. The latter is a scientific question. Science predicts nature's future behavior. And what that hypothesis entails is that the world is mental. That doesn't mean that the world is in my mind or your mind or only in our minds. No, there is a real external world out there, a world that we inhabit, a world that we both perceive. But that world, too, is made of mental states. In other words, experiential states. You can think of it like my thoughts from your perspective. My thoughts are mental, but they are not in your mind. From your point of view, my thoughts are objective. They would exist even if you were not there. They would not change just because you wish them to be different. So my thoughts are external to you and objective from your perspective, yet they are mental. In the same way, for the analytic idealist, the world is mental, even though the world is out there. It's external to us, and we can't change the world merely by wishing it to be different, and it would still be there even if we were not here observing it. Now, what we call matter, colloquially, is how these external mental states present themselves to our observation. Just like the states of the sky present themselves to an airplane's pilot in the form of dial indications on the dashboard. The dial indications convey important information about the world or the sky as it actually is, but the dashboard is not the sky. In exactly the same way, for the analytic idealist, the physical world conveys important information about the real world as it is, but the physical world is not the real world. The physical world is all our cognitive dashboard that displays our own measurements of the world to ourselves. Measurements that are made by our sensors, our retinas, our eardrums, outer surface of the skin, and so forth. And the separation between us and the world is what in psychology is called the dissociative boundary. We are mental beings in a mental world, but we seem to be separate from the world because there is a dissociative boundary between us and the world. What we call life is the dissociative boundary. It's what the dissociative boundary looks like. It looks like biology. It looks like metabolism when it's represented on our dashboard. And that's pretty much it.
That's great. That's super succinct. Thank you. So that's a great table setter right there. And actually, because I wanted to ask you in a quite curious about. I know you've talked about a little bit in previous interviews, your background, how you came to this realization. But I actually think this dovetails pretty well with decoding Jung's metaphysics, because as you write in the book, he had a profound effect on you at an early age. I believe you were a teenager when you read his preface in the I Ching. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
correct.
So
14 years old. Yeah.
14 years old, and you remember that moment. Can you tell us what was it about Jung that hit you so hard then?
Well, I didn't know anything about Jung, and when I chanced on that bookshop, it was in a mountain village. I was on holidays in the mountains, and I just chanced upon a bookshop, and there was this book with a very strange cover, a very complex diagram in the cover, and it was the I Ching, which I knew nothing about. So I just casually picked it up to have a look inside, and then there was this preface by Jung, and what I found striking in it is that he describes what the book is, and then you realize, well, this is an oracle. It's a Chinese oracle. And of course, immediately the alarm bells went off in my head, like, oh, it's one of these new age bullshit stuff, you know? Of course, it's
Sure.
not. It's thousands of years old. It far precedes the new age. But
Right.
that was my prejudice. But the way Jung then proceeded to explain why he gave it credibility, in what way he thought that an oracle actually held some water, why there could be something rationally plausible about it. That I found amazing. Yeah, it represented an opening of my mind that I don't think would have happened in another way. I mean, that somebody can be rational and still find a non trivial way to give serious thought to what my first reflex would be to consider just nonsense.
Mm,
So that opened a door in my mind that after that never closed.
interesting. And how about the main text, the I Ching? Did that stick with you as well?
Much less.
Much less.
To this day, I do throw the I Ching once a year, just after midnight on New Year's Day.
Hmm.
Um, it's a kind of private ritual that I do with my partner. Um, uh, but do I interpret it literally? Surely not. I do it as like a fun tradition. My girlfriend is from Germany, and she has this tradition every New Year to watch an old comedy sketch, like every German person does.
Hmm.
Dinner for two.
Hmm. Oh,
It's
interesting. Yeah.
or Dinner for One. It's an old, very old sketch. The same sketch is watched every year on New Year's morning or just after midnight by most
Hmm.
of Germany, and I live very
Hmm.
close to Germany. My partner is German, so we watch that too. So in addition to that, we throw the I Ching. So it's just a
Wow.
tradition, but there is a part of me that takes it seriously. But I
Hmm.
do take it symbolically. I don't, and it's not meant to be read literally anyway.
Hmm.
So to me, it's a kind of poetry. It's a kind of symbolic poetry that may have a synchronistic resonance with where I am in my life at that moment.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's cool. That's a cool tradition. And I haven't read the book myself. I have to pick it up. It's been on my reading list for a long time, but this I think is pushing me towards actually getting it in my hands. So, um, right. And now for decoding Jung's metaphysics, I know it's quite difficult to sum up um, this work because you spent, I think you talked about early on how much time you went and reread everything of Jung's before writing this book, stuff you'd already read once before. You had gone through his whole corpus and reread it. Can you give us a flavor of the high level summary of this text?
Well, Jung, for most of his career, he refused to be identified as a philosopher. He liked
Mm,
to be identified as a scientist. But towards the end of his life, he did acknowledge that he was also doing philosophy all along. He was also doing metaphysics all along. His psychology was grounded in some metaphysical thoughts that he always kept sort of implicit, but not too implicit. Um, and what this book is about is going through Jung's entire corpus and trying to extract that semi implicit metaphysics that grounds his entire psychology, that is the underlying foundation of his entire psychology. And the conclusion is that Jung was an idealist, what he calls the collective unconscious. is the world. The physical world is just how the collective unconscious presents itself to our observation, how the collective unconscious is represented in our internal dashboard of dials. And it can reach us through the intermediation of perception, which is what we would call the physical world around us, but it can also reach us endogenously from within directly through dreams and fantasies and other spontaneous imagery that arises in the human mind. Both are triggered by the collective unconscious, which makes sense in an idealist sense because our own minds are part of a broader mental landscape. So we and the collective unconscious, in fact, are the same. It's the same foundation underlying both, the same archetypes guiding both. And that's why synchronicity exists. The same archetypes that determine how my own personal mentation unfolds, my emotions, my thoughts, my fantasies, the very same archetypes guide how nature at large behaves, because both are mental expressions of one underlying field of subjectivity. So the entire psychology of Carl Jung now makes good metaphysical sense if we understand what metaphysics was actually informing his science, so to say. Metaphysics always informs science,
Mm.
implicitly or explicitly, rightly or wrongly, but it's always there. Jung was no exception to that. And the conclusion is he was, in fact, an idealist. He held the light of idealism alive through the darkness of the early and mid 20th century.
Mm. That's fascinating. And one of the things I really loved in the book, I love a great diagram or a great schematic that helps just lay everything out. And so you might recall on page 44, you have the map of the psyche where you lay out, and if it's with your permission, I can overlay it on the screen
Sure,
for
sure,
people
absolutely.
who are watching. I think it's quite helpful to have that. And so we think of the collective unconscious as the underlying thing. Should we think of that as the collective unconscious as fundamental, as not say base reality, but should we think of it as the base of all things, or is there something
Yes.
even, does it emerge from something else? Okay.
No, no. In Jungian thought, the collective unconscious is primary. It's not epiphenomenal. It's not derivative. It
Mhm.
is a foundational mental space with
Mhm.
its own dispositions and patterns of excitation that we call collective fantasies or the archetypes, which are the underlying
Mhm.
templates. But it's a primary substrate.
Got it. Okay, great. That's why I thought. And we and it pushes up, or it buoys above it is the personal unconscious, and then above that, of course, the ego conscious. And then you have instincts on the left hand side pushing onto the ego consciousness, and also the spirits or demons pushing in. Um,
Diamonds. I
oh,
like to
diamonds. Oh,
pronounce
my bad.
diamonds because otherwise people think it's demons, like a demonic, like the devil.
Yes, sorry, yeah, diamonds. And so, and the schematic you have here, it basically sums up the, I guess, and this is how Jung would have seen it as well, right? I mean, there's some interpretation that you're doing throughout the book, and quite often you're delineating between the term psyche because Jung uses that in different ways, or consciousness even in different ways. But this is precisely as Jung would have seen it, right?
I believe so.
Mhm.
Yeah, he's not
Mhm.
alive now to
I
confirm
know.
or deny it, but I believe so. Yes, I think he was clear and unambiguous enough about the structure of the psyche for this diagram to be- for me to attribute high confidence to it.
Understood. The You've probably heard, people saying, sometimes hear this from consciousness researchers, or um, people say in the psychedelic community, that say stuff like babies and little children are tripping all of the time. Um, is there anything to be said, or is it accurate to say that what would be more accurate perhaps is to say that they're experiencing more of this collective unconscious, or even the personal unconscious, that's actually what they're sort of seeing, and the ego consciousness is kind of coming online slowly? Is that close to how
I
you'd
think
explain
it's
it?
fair to say that. Of course, when we talk about psychedelic experiences, we may mean a million different things because psychedelic experiences are so incredibly varied, much more varied than life as we know it, which is already
Mm.
so varied. So it's difficult to be precise in making the statement, but I think generally speaking, children are less dissociated from the underlying substrate. Their mental inner life is less obfuscated by the sharp light of metacognitive attention. And
Mm,
therefore they are more open to the spontaneous, excitations of the underlying unconscious. Unconscious is a bad word. It is actually conscious. It's just not
mm,
meta conscious. But let's
mm,
keep using the terminology as Jung used it. I think they are indeed experiencing the personal and the collective unconscious more often than we do because they have less obfuscation, they have less developed meta awareness or metacognition, and they are less dissociated from the underlying levels of the psyche than adults are.
mm. Um, that's great. And the collective unconscious too. I mean, at least as far as I understood it, but I'm probably wrong here. I thought that it was uh, more specific to our species, so more specific to say the human condition. But it seems if this is more fundamental, are we saying that there's collective unconscious that encompasses what we know as all life? So
Not
animals,
only all
plants,
life,
etc. Yeah,
all
all things,
non-life too,
all things. Yeah, yeah.
because the Jungian concept of synchronicity depends on what we call the physical world or the inanimate world. Depends on that also being formed by archetypes. Therefore, it has to
Mm,
be psychic. It has to be mental in nature. And therefore, the collective unconscious is the level of the psyche which unifies everything, life and non-life. But of course, as you go deeper into the unconscious, there are gradations. The way to visualize it is to think of our ego consciousness as a center point. And as we
mm,
dive deeper and deeper into the psyche, there is a sphere of awareness that expands around that center point. So when you are at a certain level, that sphere starts encompassing all the other aspects of your personal inner life that you repress, that you don't remember, that you can't relate to. That's the personal unconscious. But
mm,
if that sphere keeps on enlarging, at some point you will start experiencing what is common across human beings, other people's thoughts, emotions, repressed stuff in the
mm,
psyche of humanity. But if you keep on going, you start encompassing other species, all life, and then the inanimate universe as well, all the way into quasars, black holes, magnetostars, and all the other stuff, which may be so far away we can't really access it. But under the
mm,
metaphysical underpinning that seems to have informed Jung, all of it is part of the so-called unconscious, including consciousness, which is a sort of a metacognitive folding in of the unconscious, which is psyche, which is mental. And that's the only way for synchronicities to make sense.
mm,
Otherwise, there could not be synchronicities between what happens in my mind and the inanimate world. And Jung is very clear that happens.
mm,
Therefore, the inanimate world too has to be an appearance of the collective unconscious, not only life.
mm. For synchronicities, I think it might actually be helpful too, because I'm sure many the viewers are or listeners are familiar with the concept. But how do we separate, or I guess either you personally, or how should we more broadly separate mere chance versus synchronicities? Like how do we tell the difference between the two? Mere chance
Epistemic, well,
occurrences.
mere chance is an epistemic concept. It means that we cannot find a pattern in what's happening. Then we say it's just mere chance. That
Mm,
doesn't say much about what we are observing. It says only something about our capacity to find patterns in things. So
mm,
chance is, ontologically speaking, a kind of precarious concept because it has an epistemic definition, not a nontic definition. It is possible that nothing is by mere chance. And that's, in fact, the intuition behind synchronicity. Nothing happens by mere chance. When we can trace the patterns behind something, we tend to call it causality. But things may also unfold according to organizing principles that are orthogonal to causality. In other words, there can be meaningful coincidences of events in the world, both internal events in our mind and external events in the world. There can be these meaningful coincidences between these events that do not happen because one caused the other, or because a third thing caused them both. No, they may happen together because there is a non-causal organizing principle in nature that we haven't yet scientifically modeled. And in fact, if you follow the correspondence between Jung and Paul in the early 50s, they acknowledged towards the end that these two principles, causality and synchronicity, which are orthogonal to each other, in fact, that's inflationary. If you pursue that line of thought all the way to its natural completion, you will start realizing that causality can be reduced to synchronicity. That there is, in fact, no causality. There are only meaningful coincidences. In other words, patterns of similarity. Now, the way to understand this, um, there was a non-academic philosopher in the 20th century called Alan Watts. He had a wonderful metaphor for this to explain what we mean when we say there is no actual causality. It's all just an underlying pattern. And the metaphor went as follows. Imagine that you are sitting on one side of a wooden fence and you cannot see the other side except for a little slit of empty space between two wooden pieces of the fence. So we can only see through a little slit on the fence what happens on the other side. And imagine that you know nothing, you don't know what cats are, but there's a cat walking on the other side of the fence. And when it passes by the slit and you're looking through the slit, you first see the cat's head, and a moment later you see the cat's tail. And then if the cat turns around and comes back, again, you will see first the cat's head and then the cat's tail. And if you don't know better, you will say the head caused the tail. Because every time the head appears, a moment later the tail appears. That's causality, right? If it's consistent like this, we call it causality. But there is no causation happening. The head never causes the tail. They are both part of an underlying pattern that we cannot see all at once. We only see the world through a slit. It's called the present, and it's called space as well. The present in our spatial neighborhood. That's the slit with which we see the grand pattern that reality is across time, across space, the block universe of Einstein, if you will. So we invent this precarious concept called causality to account for what we see in the slit. Synchronicity would be the cat, the whole cat, the entire pattern. And that's why there are these meaningful coincidences that cannot be accounted for by causality, because the pattern is not restricted to a slit. It's an organizing principle that gives rise to nature. And that organizing principle is given by the fundamental archetypes of nature's psyche. In other words, the fundamental properties of what nature is. To be is to have properties, right? If you exist, then there is something it is to be you. You could be somebody else, but no, you're you and not somebody else. That is what your properties define, your uniqueness, what it is to be you. Same thing about nature at large. Nature is what it is, not something else it could conceivably be. And it is what it is because it has the dispositions it has. Those dispositions we call archetypal templates. And those templates define the cat. And because we only see the cat through the slit, we talk about causality, but ultimately everything is synchronicity. Everything is a pattern of meaningful coincidences, if you want. Why meaningful? Well, because nature is psychic, nature is mental, and mind works according to links of meaning, semantic associations, right? That's why the archetypes express themselves through what we call coincidences of meaning, because the structure of nature is a semantic structure. It appears spatio-temporal to us because that's how we represent nature in our internal dashboard of dials. But nature, as it is in itself, is a semantic structure. It exists all at once, outside time, outside space. And that's why synchronicities happen.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. That was really super well put. And is that, you mentioned the fence, the cover of Brief Peaks Beyond for folks who want that is that you actually?
No, it's just some stock photograph.
Just some stock photograph. Okay, I wasn't sure. I was like, was wondering if that's too peeking through. Um, there's a lot of other questions, like different paths we could go down here. For the archetypes with Jung, I've always wondered, is there a, I wonder why these archetypes are there, let's say. I mean, the world has to be represented via images or it has to be represented in some way. But is
No, no,
there, oh, sorry. Yeah,
the archetypes are prior to representation. The
sure. All
archetypes
right.
are there because nature is something as opposed to something else.
Mm, mm,
So to be is to have properties, right? To be is to be what you are as opposed to something else you could conceivably be. Nature is what it is, not something else it could conceivably be. How do you describe what it is? Well, through archetypes. Archetypes mean precisely that, the primordial template according to which nature unfolds
mm,
and does what it does. The archetypal templates according to which nature natures, the
mm,
natura naturans of Spinoza, right?
mm,
And they are there because something has to be there, because whatever is what it is and not something else. So archetypal templates are not something added, something that
mm,
could be perceived as unnecessary. No, nature could just be nature. Why does it have archetypes? Well, because you cannot just be. To be is to have properties. We simply
mm,
call those properties archetypes.
mm. Okay, yes, thank you for that distinction. Yeah, sure. We only see the shadow of the archetype, or we see we represent the archetype in some way, right? I
Correct.
think that it would be a better way to describe it, and in so many different ways, even though we follow much of the same story. And or oftentimes it's a similar. I'm thinking of like the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's monomyth. Um, we show it in so many different ways. So I'd love to, and one of the things I was thinking about with the book, and then uh, actually the same thing happened with Schopenhauer, with Decoding Schopenhauer, where I'm reading the book, each book, at different times, and I I'm kind of following along a little bit halfway, and then I get to the end, and there's like a few pages at the end where everything comes together, and then I'm
Yeah.
like 99% of the way. I'm like, wow, it all just comes together and I have like the pages written out here because they're so powerful. And with Decoding Jung, it starts at about page 110, where you start talking about like what is the meaning of this, like why these processes exist. And one of the things that I really love about your work in general, and specifically these books, is that you actually propose something, propose a reason why these mechanisms exist, right?
Well, Jung
Um,
does.
Jung does, yeah, and you explicate it, you help explain it for the reader. And I hate to do a disservice, but would you like to share what I guess Jung's idea for the rigmarole, like why we have this entire process?
Sure. Well, if everything is a field of experience, a field of mentation, the great collective unconscious within which our own human metaconsciousness appears, um, then the history, our cosmological history, the history of existence, is the history of that universal mind, if you will, that universal psyche evolving. When I say evolving, I don't necessarily mean evolving in what we might judge to be a positive direction, but uh,
Mm,
unfolding itself. That's the history of our universe. It's the history of this one universal mind unfolding and expressing itself. And every indication points to the notion that integral to this unfolding is the development of what we today call metaconsciousness. At the time of Jung, they simply called it consciousness
mhm,
because no, they only had clinical psychology at the time, so you're always dependent on what people report to be experiencing to discern consciousness. But of course, reportability is already meta consciousness. You have to experience and to know that you are experiencing in order to report something. That's
mm,
the origin of the confusion. But
mm,
you could say that under Jung, the evolution of the universe and the evolution of life is the evolution towards meta consciousness, the awareness of awareness, the taking explicit notice of experience and saying, oh, this is what's happening. And for Jung, this is a second act of creation. It invests existence with a whole new level of existentiality, if you will. It
Mm.
reinforces the substance of existence, because now we are not simply experiencing things instinctively without the light of attention, without the light of metacognition. Now we take explicit notice of the experiencing that constitutes the evolution of nature. And that's a second act of creation that nature achieves through us. Nature sees itself with attention, with metacognition, through our eyes. And that may be the goal of it all. It's this second life of creation by means of which nature takes account of its own existence explicitly.
And nature can't do that without us or without some conscious meta awareness,
Every
it seems.
indication
Yeah.
is that it can't, because
Mm.
animals are not metacognitive. Maybe some
Mm.
very highly evolved other animals like pachyderms, cetaceans, some advanced mollusks like octopuses, maybe. But the jury is still out on that. We know that we are metacognitive. So
Mm.
these bipedal apes here are metacognitive. Um, and if that's, the raison d'être of life, if that's what life is all about, then it's not about us. It's about our service to the whole of nature through our metacognitive eyes. It's this second act of creation that nature
Mm.
performs through our perception, through our cognition. Um, and it's not about whether you are happy or sad, whether you achieved your egoic little goals and your dreams of consumption. It's not about that. It's not about whether you're ill or healthy. It's not about that. It's about taking explicit account of whatever is happening through your eyes. Whether it's good or bad, it's secondary. It's taking explicit account of what you're feeling and perceiving. That's what it's all about. If people understood that, life would be a lot easier.
Mm. And how can we, well, I guess you mentioned, I'm not sure if it was in Decoding Jung or if it was in Schopenhauer, that you oftentimes have conversations with people about these topics and they end up saying, like, I forget how you put it. It's like a joke without a punchline or something. Like they have to say, okay, but now what do I do with that? Right.
Oh,
I mean, but so I don't want to ask you that because otherwise I'm just
it's
falling into that
okay.
trap. But I do, I mean, sitting with the truth or sitting with that is like enough on its own, I think. But how do we apply that, or how can we be more, say, meta aware, or um, how do we lift this?
It's a change in our inner chatter.
Mm.
Our experience is always modulated by our inner chatter. We don't experience life as it is. We experience it partly as it is and partly as we tell ourselves it is. And so that second part is our inner chatter. Normally, that inner chatter goes as follows. If you fail, oh, I am a failure. I didn't achieve my goals. Oh, but I really wanted that. Or if you get terminally ill, oh, I'm going to suffer. Oh, I'm suffering and I can't leave and everybody else can leave. Why is this happening? So that's the inner chatter we normally have. Under the understanding of Jung's greatest insight in his book Answer to Job, which we just discussed,
Mm.
the inner chatter would go like this. Everything is falling on top of my head. Everything's going wrong. Nature is experiencing this through me. If this were not happening to me, nature wouldn't be experiencing this as I am. My experiences are nature's experiences. Everything I experience means that nature is turning over a rock somewhere and looking underneath into its own hidden secrets and gaining awareness of what it is doing to itself. So if you were suffering and if you are the subject of profound injustice, morally, I think we should stop things from happening that are unjust. But if it's happening anyway, the inner chatter is it is through the injustice and the suffering that I am experiencing that nature is now becoming aware that these things can happen in nature. It is through my sacrifice that nature evolves, that nature gains insight into what it is doing to itself. That's my role. My role is that of a sacrificial life. It's that of being a metacognitive spy for nature. Is that of telling God what it means to be a human being suffering in this world. Because without that, God doesn't know. That's what the book of Job is all about, right? God doesn't know what he or she or they or it is doing to Job. Job has to go and confront Job with the reality of injustice. Sorry, confront God with the reality of injustice. For God to evolve and become more metacognitively aware of what it is doing to its creation. In other words, to what it's doing to itself. That's the role of our sacrificial life. And if we understand that, our inner chatter changes fundamentally, and we add less meta suffering, unnecessary suffering, to the suffering that is already naturally intrinsic to life. We don't torture ourselves in addition to life already torturing us.
Mm, gotcha. One level of torture is enough. We don't need to add
Plenty. Yeah. Yeah.
the uh, and yes, you're right about the and the book of Job. I forget that God wants to become man by means of the biblical incarnation.
Oh no, that's
Does
later.
oh that's later.
That's in the New Testament already.
Oh
In
okay.
the
Oh sorry.
Bible. Oh, you mean Answer to Job? Yeah, in Answer to Job,
Yeah, and it's Job.
Jung explains this how the
Hmm.
Christian scriptures um, actually symbolically convey the story of the evolution of the universal mind, right? The book of Job in the Old Testament lets us see how non metacognitive God is. It's not
Hmm.
explicitly aware of the consequences of what it's doing. When Job confronts God, the first thing that God does is to go on a tirade saying, I am the power behind the storms. Who are you? That's very unconscious in Jungian terminology. It lacks
Hmm.
empathy. It lacks explicit awareness of what's going on. It's a sort of an instinctive, knee-jerk reaction to things. And so Job taught God that there were severe implications to God's unconsciousness or lack of metaconsciousness. That the consequence of that was great suffering from the point of view of the eyes of humans. And that sort of planted a hint in God's mind that he was missing out on a lot. He didn't know how to look at the world through human eyes, through man's
Hmm.
eyes, to speak in old style. And that was then the intimation of what happens in the New Testament, in which God becomes man in order to directly experience that. So Job
Hmm.
planted that seed by confronting God and stimulated God to spontaneously incarnate and look at the world through man's eyes. Not only that, but to suffer, to be crucified. And that was Jesus' sacrifice to his Father, which ultimately is our destiny. It's what we are all doing. We are all living a life of sacrifice to the universal mind. So the universal mind can learn about itself through our cognitive eyes, through our
Hmm.
suffering. If people understand that, our notions of failure and success, of shame, between the differences between pride and shame, all of this stuff would dissolve, would evaporate like water under the sun. We would then become much more aware of what, for instance, the Christian mythology is actually hinting at. All of us are living lives of sacrifice. That's the imitatio Christi. That's the imitation of Christ. It's not only an imitation, it's walking the path. It's a path of sacrifice. Understand that, and your life will always have meaning, whatever happens. It will have so much meaning, you would drop the question of meaning altogether, just like fish drop the question of water altogether, right? It doesn't occur to
Hmm.
them to start discussing, well, is there water here or not? No, they're immersed in this stuff. You can have a life so immersed in meaning that the very question when you wake up in the morning, does my life have any meaning? It doesn't pop anymore because it's so present. You're overwhelmed with it. You still suffer, but you meta suffer less. and your life will always have a purpose, whatever is happening to you. The notions of nihilism, purposelessness, senselessness, it disappears, just goes away. Jung achieved that, and he tried to show us the way to achieve that too.
Hmm. Do you engage in any practices that help with that process? I'm
I
thinking.
engage in a
Yeah.
very, very accessible practice called paying attention to life. That's my spiritual path. I pay attention to life. And then people often ask me, can you elaborate? What do you mean by that? I mean exactly that. Just
Mm,
pay attention to life. People want to look for complexity. If I say something as simple as pay attention to life, they think, no, it cannot be only that. It has to be something more nuanced, structured, subtle, complex, right? So please elaborate, Bernardo. There's nothing to elaborate. It's just that. Pay attention to life. That's all. That's my practice.
mm,
Pay attention to what's happening. Pay attention to what you're experiencing. But just pay attention. If you pay attention, something in you comes up and often gives you practical answers. Certainly
mm.
gives you acceptance of what you cannot change.
Right. Have you found a meditation helpful with that? I don't know if you've engaged in any.
I'm not good at these things. I have a very analytic mind.
Mm,
It's very difficult to shift my consciousness from its baseline state of, you know, ordinary awareness. Even I have done psychedelics several times, but I need pretty high doses to
mm,
really shift my mind off baseline consciousness. So I'm too hard-headed. You know, all this spiritual stuff doesn't really work much with
mm,
me. So, but now I'm 50. I've accepted that. I've struggled against it for a while because I thought, can I be so hard-headed, so incompetent in all these psychological and spiritual disciplines? Now I accepted it, and so when people ask me what's my spiritual practice, I just say this because it's true. I pay attention to life. And
mm,
life is a great teacher. And we don't see it because we don't expect to find a teacher in life. We need a guru. And in that anxious search for the guru, we miss the guru that is always there, right in front of us. We don't see it. We start seeing through it, which is a tragedy.
mm.
Life is the greatest guru. Just pay attention and you know what I
Pay
mean.
attention. Yeah. The hmm. Does and you briefly talked about a few experiences with psychedelics. Did they inform your current ideas, or did they confirm what you already suspected was true? I don't know if you want to, or
Yeah,
if they
here I
it's
have to
happening at
be
the same
careful.
time.
I
Yeah.
am skeptical of psychedelic gnosis. I'm skeptical of people who come back and say, I've talked to blue aliens from the Pleiades who are sending heart vibrations from the galactic center. I'd say, no,
Mm,
you're making a primary mistake here of
mm,
interpreting the imagery that arises from the psyche as something literal. That's not how the psyche talks to itself. The psyche talks to itself through symbols, evocative symbols, symbols that evoke meaning. You should never take them literally, otherwise, you miss what they are pointing to. It's like somebody has a finger pointing in a certain way, and you become absorbed in looking at the finger, and you never look at what the finger is pointing to. You know,
mm,
you miss out on everything. So I think a psychedelic trip is like the finger. It points at something, but what
mm,
people usually take back from it as psychedelic gnosis is a description of the finger and missing out on everything. So what psychedelics did for me is the following. I was already an idealist when I tripped for the first time. I was in my mid 30s. This is something I did as an adult, as a sort of research enterprise. I was not trying to have fun. I think it's preposterous to take a psychedelic in a party, for instance. I think it's
mm,
a complete misunderstanding of what psychedelics are. But what I took back from it is the following: it's the power of mind to invest a sense of external reality to its own creations. When we are in a
mm,
psychedelic trip, we often think that it's more real than this reality. It's this overwhelming sense of reality. Like now I'm peeking behind the curtains on the stage. Now I'm seeing things how they really, really, really are. Um, to me, what that means is when we tell ourselves now that this is real, it's the same dynamics at play. This too is a mental construct. It's not
Mm,
something outside mind. Just like your very real psychedelic trip is obviously something inside mind. It's not outside mind. If you're talking to blue aliens and there is somebody next to you, that somebody would still see you right there. You're not in the Pleiades talking to blue aliens, right? It's a mental reality created in your mind. The same thing applies here. So to me, that's the main takeaway from a psychedelic trip. That
mm,
this, right now, too, is a trip. This is
mm,
not an external world outside mind. It's outside my little egoic mind, but not outside mind as a type, as a kind of existence. This world too is made of mental states. Even though they're not my egoic mental states, they are still mental.
mm. Yeah.
Just
And you
like
don't
my
talk about,
psychedelic trip is made of
right.
mental states that are not
It's the
my
same way.
egoic mental states, but they are still mental.
But they're still mental. I see. Yeah. And you don't talk, you talk, it's not in Decoding Jung, but it is in Brief Peaks Beyond. You actually pull out it was some studies that were done about psychedelic brain function. And they'd found that, let's see, the more the drug deactivated the brain, the more intense were the subjective experiences reported by the subject. So, as a pretty compelling piece of evidence for idealism, you'd expect for people saying that they're undergoing some psychedelic imagery and they're having a trip, but the brain is actually reducing. And you mentioned that it was similar to the Huxleyan idea of the mind as a what was it a reducing
Mind at
valve.
large. Yeah,
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 mind at
correct.
large. Yeah, the reducing
Yeah.
valve. Can you tell us more about that? I mean, and also in comparison to, I mean, not to try to pack too much into one question, but versus in lucid dreaming, because I actually think this is where it gets most compelling when scientists look at brain imaging for people under lucid dreaming. If they do things in the dream, they can find correlates for that with brain function.
Yeah.
So um, I think those two things in combination lend a lot of credence to idealism.
Yeah, we have to be careful here. The claim is not that all reductions of brain activity will expand consciousness. We know for a
Mm-hmm.
fact that that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Most
Sure.
reductions of brain function or brain activity or brain metabolism will correlate with cognitive decline, with less and less intense experience.
Mm-hmm.
Under analytic idealism, this is perfectly understandable because if we are dissociated mental complexes in the mind of nature, our brain activity is what the contents of the dissociation look like when they are observed from the outside and represented on a dashboard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because brain activity is physical. Um, most reductions of brain activity on the dashboard should thus correlate with a weakening of the dissociative mental processes that brain activity is an image of. So that would line up with physicalism. It would make the same prediction. The difference is that analytic idealism would predict that certain specific patterns of reduction in neurometabolism, those specific patterns would correlate with the dissociative mechanism itself instead of the contents of the dissociation. And if you reduce the power of the dissociative mechanism itself, now you can become aware of things that are on the other side of the dissociative boundary and which will not correlate with your brain activity because brain activity is what the dissociation looks like, right? If you weaken the boundary, you can reach out beyond the boundaries that correspond to your physical brain when represented on a dashboard. That's what dissociative boundaries are all about. They
Mm-hmm.
insulate inner mental processes from mental processes on the other side of the dissociative boundary. But if you weaken the boundary, if you render the boundary more porous, more permeable, there will be cognitive commerce across the boundary. And you could then experience enriched awareness. I think that's what psychedelics and a number of other things do. They will reduce the dissociation itself as opposed to impairing the contents of the dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow they preferentially attack the brain processes that are what the dissociative mechanism itself looks like. And a reduction in dissociation is by definition an enrichment of mental inner life because you're less isolated from your cognitive surroundings and you can start reach out into the world as it is in itself and experience that stuff directly. And that would not have a correlating brain activity because the brain is what the dissociation and its contents look like. So that's the claim. And psychedelics can do this. Hyperventilation can do this because it increases blood alkalinity and causes vasoconstriction in your brain and therefore reduce brain activity as well. That's why there are spiritual practices based on breath work, hyperventilation. It reduces dissociation and gives you a much broader sense of self. It sort of allows you to reach into your cognitive surroundings and gain insight into what is actually going on and what you actually are. Because we think we are the contents of the dissociation, which is of course an illusion. Other things too. There was a study in Brazil of mediums, and it turns out that mediums in trance states exhibit significantly reduced brain activity in all areas related to writing, language, and rational thinking. And yet they can write much more complex text than placebo controls, who are not really mediums and trying to write complex text. So there is a wealth of evidence that although in most cases a reduction in brain activity correlates with a reduction in the richness or intensity of conscious awareness, which is what analytic and idealism predicts too, in some special cases, the opposite is true, which contradicts physicalism, but analytic idealism also predicts that there should be some cases in which the correlation is reversed. And that's exactly what we observe.
Interesting. While we're in this area of, I guess I call this like corroborating evidence or hints at the truth, let's say. In Decoding Jung, you do mention that you have a brief section on parapsychological phenomena and state that they're most likely real. Actually, I interviewed, you might be familiar with Tom Campbell, who wrote My Big Toe.
Yeah.
I think you've actually done an interview or two with along with him. What would you say is the most convincing evidence of this like psi phenomena?
Yeah, I'm not really a student of Psi, and
Mm,
I'm open-minded to it, but I'm not a student of it. I'll tell you why. One is character. I just don't
mm,
have the inclination, but I
mm,
explain it to myself in the following way. I find the ordinary amazing, very
mm,
difficult to explain. I find
mm,
it amazingly difficult to explain why we have certain thoughts, why we have certain emotions, what life is, what is our relationship to supernova, because we know that every atom in our body except hydrogen and helium was cooked up inside of a star that exploded at some point in the remote past. And that stuff is in us. All of those debris are in us. So I
mm,
find the ordinary already extraordinary, already very
mm,
discombobulating, incredible, amazing. The ordinary is amazing. So I have very little emotional energy to dedicate to the para-ordinary, to the parapsychological. It's
mm,
not that I deny that it can happen. I think it's perfectly reasonable to think it does happen. I just don't feel invested emotionally in it. Now, because of this, I am not qualified to tell you what the best laboratory evidence is for psi phenomenon. The reason I take it seriously is twofold. One, analytic idealism makes room for it. Under analytic idealism, life is what a dissociative process in the mind of nature looks like. A perfect dissociative process will completely insulate you from what is happening beyond the boundaries of the dissociation, beyond your brain, so to say. So there should be no psi under perfect dissociation.
mm,
But no process in nature is perfect. When it stops raining, the sun doesn't dry everything immediately, right? When something is burning, not everything that is combustible actually
mm,
burns in a fire. Stuff is left. No process in nature is perfect. Why would dissociation be? And if dissociation is not perfect, then occasionally, under specific circumstances, it stands to reason that you could reach out and pick up on a thought that is out there in the ether or somebody else's emotion. that you could pick out something related to the future, because past and future is just categories of experience. We organize our information about the whole pattern, the cat behind the fence, the world. We organize information about the world in these little drawers we call past, present, and future, near, semi-near, and far away. These are our mechanisms for avoiding cognitive overload, for organizing data about the world. But the world is always out there, complete. The cat is always complete out there, past, present, future, here and beyond. So it stands to reason that sometimes the dissociative mechanisms that organize this data about the world to prevent cognitive overload, sometimes they will falter and we will actually have a mini cognitive overload and we will see something about the future, or we will know something that we cannot perceive around the corner. So analytic idealism renders it, I wouldn't say plausible, but renders it coherent to imagine that psi phenomena can happen. So that's the first
Mm.
reason I take it seriously. The second reason is I have seen it happen to people around me in ways that I just cannot dismiss. I was there, and I'm not going to start preaching to skeptics that this really happens. I don't care what they think. I've seen it happening to people around me, and because I'm not alarmed by it, because I think it's perfectly natural that such things
Right.
could happen, it just confirms that position. But I'm not preaching that. It's because I'm not emotionally connected with that. It's not my thing to go and
Mm.
convince the world that psi phenomena exists. I think we have more
Right.
serious problems, like understanding what reality is, before we
Mm.
start talking about the extraordinary.
Yeah. That reminds me when you said that like nature's not perfect. Even dissociative processes aren't going to be perfect. It reminds me of, I forget exactly. I think it's in the Jewish tradition where there's an angel of forgetfulness who,
Oh yeah,
when you're
Lila.
in, okay, yeah, yeah, they
Mm.
sometimes the angel of forgetfulness forgets uh to
To
strike your memory
touch,
of the
yeah, to touch
yeah.
you here, it's creating the pilfram, I think. There's a
Yeah.
little ridge around your upper lip, which is supposed to
Yeah.
make you forget your state before the dissociation, before
Mm-hmm.
life. Now, Greek mythology is replete with allusions to this,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
our consciousness was much more expanded before we um, adopted this particular state of consciousness that we call life, that appears on the dashboard as biology. And so that is symbolically illustrated through the angel of forgetfulness, yes, that makes us
Mm.
forget what it was like to be in a non-dissociated or a less dissociated state. Dissociation is the forgetting. It is what dissociation does. So the myth is plausible, yeah,
Yeah.
symbolically
The
speaking.
symbolically, sure. Something you said a moment ago was interesting, that you find the ordinary amazing.
Mm.
And sometimes I wonder, because I think to myself, um, hmm, like, when is it going too far to find, say, meaning in all things? Maybe it can't be taken to a extreme. Maybe it can. But I can imagine if one is, how should I say it? Sometimes well, a few months ago, I was I was trying to get into a study, a psychedelic study actually, and I've only had a handful of experiences in my own life, so I'm not well versed in that area. But they asked me if I ever thought I saw signs in the world. They had this question, to try to suss people out, or they have to get the right kinds of people into their study. And I guess I should have said no, but I told them honestly that yes, I do. Sometimes in the waking life, something appears to me that I feel like is more significant than anyone else might seem to be a sign, a literal sign sometimes. But it strikes me very strongly, and I can't explain it.
Mhm.
I can't impart that on somebody else. But I feel like, and I haven't admitted that to many people, but because people think you're, or could think you're nuts, people could think this is the sign of early schizophrenia or something. Then, it's a problem. So, is there a way to balance that, or does it need to be balanced? Is
Uh,
that yeah?
I think it's a question of discernment. So
Mm,
let me try to bring you along through three levels of discernment.
Hmm.
To say that the world is amazing is not necessarily to say that everything in the world has meaning.
Hmm.
Something can be amazing and not have meaning, and nonetheless amazing. Um, Sunset in the mountains is amazing, even if I don't project any particular meaning to it. It's still amazing. The view of an alpine valley is amazing, whether I project meaning to it or not. In fact, it is so amazing. It captures you so much that the question of meaning doesn't even rise. It's like, what are you talking about? You know, you're
Hmm.
bathing in the amazingness of the moment that requires no meaning to exist. So that's the first level of discernment. Not everything that is amazing needs to be meaningful. The second level of discernment is this: to say that everything has meaning, which I believe is the case. I will make this statement my own. I think everything has meaning. To say that is not to say that every meaning we project onto things is true. It's perfectly coherent for me to talk to somebody who is severely paranoid schizophrenic, who projects all kinds of fantastic meanings in what's happening. It's perfectly coherent for me to turn to this person and say, you are hallucinating these meanings, and still say everything has meaning.
Hmm. Hmm.
Everything may have meaning, but that meaning is not necessarily what you are hallucinating.
Hmm.
You see what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yep, I do.
So, and we often lose sight of this discernment. A lot of people, especially so-called skeptics, would say, if you think everything has meaning, then you're validating schizophrenia. No, no, everything can have meaning, and that meaning is still not what people make up, what people project onto nature. As a matter of fact, I think we as bipedal apes who have been running around this rock for only 300,000 years, we are not evolved enough to even begin to capture the true meaning of things. So whatever we are projecting onto nature is our own stuff. It's our own paranoias, our own schizophrenia, our own meaning making that it's projecting onto nature. Because what is, statistically speaking, the chance that a bipedal ape who has been running around for only 300,000 years has evolved the cognitive system required to discern the salient meaning of the universe? It's very unlikely. So I think that's an important distinction. I think sometimes, because we are part of nature, we are not floating in isolation. We didn't parachute in here. We are like fruits in the tree of nature. We are rooted in nature. Because of that, through our intuitive roots, we may occasionally glimpse meanings around us that are real. But if we do that, we would never be able to word it, because I think it's preposterous that thinking bipedal apes who have had an intellect for only about 30 to 50,000 years, when symbolic thinking evolved, that would be enough to word the salient meanings of nature. It's like asking whether a termite can understand quantum field theory. It's the
Hmm.
same kind of thing that you are expecting. So I do believe that occasionally we can intuit the meaning of things, but I think people who do, their only reaction will be to shut up, because what they know, whatever they start saying, it's already wrong. You start
Hmm.
moving your tongue, opening your lips, it's already wrong.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
hopeless. So this is something that arises within our inner lives and should stay there, at least for a couple more million years, when maybe we have
Hmm.
evolved enough to start making objective assessments of nature's meaning.
Yeah. There's something you were saying earlier about we were talking about Job and well, Jung's proposition that we are here because um, God can't experience, say, self-consciousness or something like that, that we have to experience what that is. Do you ever have materialists, people say atheists, who say, because it reminds me of something like you've probably heard this phrase, we are the universe trying to understand itself. That might have been Watts actually, or McKenna, I can't remember. I'm not sure who said that, but
Um,
Do we have to take? Yeah, do you remember?
It was a physicist, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
he
The
was a
former
physicist.
host of Cosmos,
Oh,
Carl
Sagan.
Sagan.
Yeah, Sagan. Okay. And so it's funny because if you take away the idea, so much of this seems like kind of self-evident in a way, in that, I mean, not easy, not simple, but um, even if you take away the idea that consciousness is at the base, like even materialists would agree that if it's all just material, we literally are the universe come to
Yeah,
be
yeah, the
conscious,
statement
metaconscious,
holds.
right?
Yeah,
The
the
statement
statement
holds.
holds.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's like the magic, the wonder doesn't have to be, yeah, the delineation. I mean,
It
is
holds
there a
more.
difference though? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it holds more profoundly under idealism because
Mm,
under
mm,
idealism, the mind that is doing the understanding is of the
mm,
same kind of the thing that is
mm.
understood.
Right.
Both are mental. Under physicalism, there is this impassable chasm between the two, in which the thing doing the understanding is of a completely different nature than the thing understood. Because under physicalism, mind is supposed to be a sort of epiphenomenon of ephemeral arrangement of matter. So, yes, the statement still holds quite literally, but it holds less profoundly than under idealism, because under idealism, you are of the same kind as the thing understood. There is no fundamental chasm between you and the thing understood. And
Right.
if you really internalize this insight, you will see that it makes the statement much more profound, with much more profound implications when it's made under the umbrella of idealism than when it's made under the umbrella of physicalism. But it applies in both cases, I concur.
Yeah. No, but that's a good point. I'd love to turn to decoding Schopenhauer's metaphysics, because if I recall, Schopenhauer came into your life much later than Jung, or he
Correct.
started to impact your thought later. Can you tell us about how you started to come upon his thought, and I guess how it's impacted you?
Oh, synchronicity. um, I was already an idealist. I had already published a number of books on idealism. So my metaphysics was more or less already quite stable. Um, and I think, I like to read. I'm doing a lot less reading now because it just started a company, and then I have my foundation, not mine, but I have the foundation I direct and this company and other things I do. So I have a lot less time for reading now. But at the time in question, I like to read a lot. And I remember reading a little book called, it's one of a series of Oxford University Press. A very short introduction. That's the name of the series. And I
Oh
read a
yeah,
book
I'm
called
familiar with it. Yeah.
Schopenhauer, a very short introduction. And that book irritated me and it confused me because the writer, he quoted Schopenhauer, and then he proceeded to elaborate on how he interpreted those quotes. I hadn't read Schopenhauer yet, but
Mm,
only by reading the quote I realized that, oh, his interpretation makes no sense. The quote is quite clear. Why is he trying to sort of, extract meanings that are not here? It's not
mm,
written in here. And why is he in this hopeless trip of discovery when there is nothing to discover? It's right there. The quote is quite clear. But at first I thought, I'm not a scholar of Schopenhauer. I never read Schopenhauer's books. So who am I to judge this guy who's supposed to be an expert? So I thought
sure.
I'm going to read The World as Will and Representation first. And I read it, and it just confirmed everything for me. And I realized the man is so absolutely clear. Why are these academic bozos distorting the whole thing? And my conclusion, I don't spare my words here because it really frustrated me. My conclusion is that people who make a living of interpreting dead philosophers, often they cannot understand them. They just don't have the cognitive ability
Mm,
to understand what dead philosophers meant. But instead of recognizing that, like, well, I can't understand this, they think that it's just the dead philosopher who didn't write well. And they start
mm,
making up shit. You understand?
mm. Yeah,
Because they
yeah. Oh
can't
yeah.
understand it, but they don't admit that they're just incapable of understanding the very clear prose of the guy. They start making up stuff and accusing Schopenhauer of essentially being an idiot, which is what has is accused in that little book, Schopenhauer, a very brief introduction. The
Mm.
author, several times, maybe he doesn't use these exact words, but several times, he basically says that Schopenhauer is an idiot who was very confused. At some point, he
Mm.
says, Schopenhauer must be very confused here. No, it's you, you idiot, who are very confused, not the philosopher who is no longer around to defend himself.
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah.
that really hooked me at a very emotional level. It's like I needed to vindicate the man. So I proceeded to read everything, make sure that I make copious notes, cross check my thinking multiple times, basing everything on multiple quotations that, in context, not taking anything out of context. And I wrote this short little book in which the attempt was not to say everything Schopenhauer had to say, but to give people sort of a map to understand what he said so clearly, to try to reduce the chance that he would be so misunderstood again by idiots, idiots who make a living out of spouting nonsense about people who are no longer alive to explain themselves and defend themselves against the accusations they are subject to.
Mm. Yeah. And is one of the misconceptions about Schopenhauer, um, well, I've always heard of him. One of the first things that I've heard about him is that he's a pessimist. That seems to be keeping continuing. Is that accurate? Would you say?
Well, it's impossible to categorically state that that's not accurate because this comes through in many, many, many passages of Schopenhauer. But
Hmm.
he is not gratuitously pessimist.
Mm.
His pessimism, you have to understand it in context, in his historical context. He wrote The World as Will and Representation in the first 18 years of the 19th century. The world was about to face a profound transformation caused by the Industrial Revolution. So by the time
Mm.
of the 1830 revolution, the world had moved from the edifying spirit or ethos of the early Enlightenment to the more cynical and practical ethos post-industrial revolution, which we are still living through today. That's the time where he wrote. He wrote in the phase of that transition from the edifying romantic ethos from the late 18th century to the down to earth pragmatic ethos of early capitalism and the industrial revolution after the 1830 revolution. Um, his pessimism is a reflection of that transition from romanticism to cynicism. And it's a reflection of his willingness to be absolutely committed to what is true given the evidence, as opposed to what we would like to be true, or the comforting narratives of the romanticism that we were growing out of. And, uh, and he looked around the world and he understood the world is mind. He called it will. Will is an archetypal manifestation of mind. It is the
Hmm.
fuel for mind's self excitation. He looked at the world which he knew was mental, and what he saw were animals that had to kill other animals in order to survive. And that killing entailed blood, torture, savagery, and that was built into nature. And he didn't know that, but looking at it from today's eyes, supernova explode and decimate any solar system harboring life within many light years around, sometimes thousands of light years beyond. If you happen to be right in the direction of one of the jets, then you're barbecue. That's the universe. Black holes swallowing up galaxies. In the center of almost every galaxy, there is a black hole swallowing everything up. So forget just lions killing elephants and eating them alive and conscious for 6 hours before they pass out, which happens. At the cosmic level, the picture is worse, right? So when you come from the edifying romanticism and the religious stories of Christianity before it was sort of overcome by the scientific spirit, Christianity would say this is the best possible world. and it's a kind of school, so we have to go through trials. But God is good; it's all love. Coming from that ethos, and then looking at reality empirically, and having the honesty to acknowledge what the evidence suggests, is construed as pessimism. Why? Because he emphasized it. Today, would we emphasize it? Would I emphasize it? No, because we all know it. But in his time, he had to emphasize it because the
Mm.
ethos was very different and he was in that transition of ethos. So, was he a pessimist? Yes, but no more than I am. And you wouldn't call me a pessimist. On the contrary, you would say, well, Bernardo's philosophy, it's helpful. If it's not edifying, it's at least encouraging. It gives us perspective. It goes against nihilism. Well, I'm just as pessimist as Schopenhauer, literally.
Mm.
If you
Mm.
would really explore what I think and what he wrote, I would agree with him in
Mm.
most cases. But you don't call me a pessimist because I never had to emphasize it. He lived in a time in which he did. He had
Mm.
to emphasize it because the ethos of his time would precondition people to interpreting his words in a particular way that would have been wrong. So he had to prevent that by emphasizing things that were contrary to what people would normally expect from a philosopher.
Mm.
So was he a pessimist? Yes, but trivially so. He was not particularly pessimistic. I would rather call him a realist. And there are many passages in Schopenhauer which are very optimistic. His interpretation of what music is wonderful. Music is the closest thing to the archetypal will. The rhythm and flow and rhyme of music reflects how natures.
Mm.
Nature also has a rhythm, a flow, and rhyme, which we can appreciate and delight in, just as we delight in the tunes of music. So you don't need to go to a Wagner concert and go through all the operas of the Ring cycle to have that delight. Just look around, pay attention to life. Life is
Mm.
music. That's Schopenhauer. Is
Mm.
this pessimistic? We are immersed in the music of existence, and it's beautiful. Schopenhauer goes ahead and says that the only way for us to overcome the personal will, because the personal will is what makes us unhappy, because we want things that we can't achieve. And he says the way to overcome that and stop making yourself unhappy, because that's what we do. By wishing what can't be achieved, we make ourselves unhappy. You stop that by taking your attention away from the chatter of your personal will and moving it to the world. Look at the world. Let the world overwhelm you, and you will
Mm.
no longer be unhappy. Is this pessimistic? It's not pessimistic, right? And yet,
Right.
I can't just answer your question very simply and say, no, Schopenhauer was not a
Sure.
pessimist.
Oh yeah.
12 scholars would pop out of the woodwork and confront me with multiple passages showing that he was pessimistic. Well,
Sure.
so I had to give that nuance
Yeah.
so you understand what I mean.
I do. Yeah, it's important nuance, and actually, you touched on so many other. You answered like five questions I had somehow by a time unrelated to that one question, but you are able to touch on so much. The actually because we laid so much groundwork with Jung, can you? I mean, and the way I read it, the conclusions of these two books they came together pretty closely. I mean, they align pretty closely. But actually, maybe it'd be helpful to say where they depart, if they depart in any ways.
Now,
The
they
ideas of
depart in
Jung.
emphasis.
Okay.
The emphasis is different. There are certain aspects that one leaves uncovered and the other not.
Mm.
For instance, Schopenhauer doesn't directly account for why and how the personal will became separated from the universal will.
Mm.
There is a chapter in the second volume of The World as Will and Representation in which he elaborates deeply into cognitive associations.
Mm.
And he explains how cognitive associations weaves our inner life together, weaves the motions of our inner personal will together. it would have been a small step to say, well, the personal will is different or separated in some sense from the universal will because of dissociations, because of a failure of associations, which he had just discussed in
Hmm.
depth in a chapter. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't actually bite the bullet and try to account for why the will in me seems to be disjoint from the will of nature, even though both are only one and the same will, which he
Right.
says. He says that the will in me is the same will as the will outside. But why do we experience space time then? Why don't I experience the unity of the will? He doesn't say that. Jung does. Not as explicitly as modern philosophy does, as analytic idealism does, but Jung goes much closer into suggesting that because Jung explains what he means by consciousness. And it's not what we today call phenomenal consciousness. It's not pure experience. It has to be experience that is deeply internally associated. It has to be meta cognitive, and it has to be within a coherent associative context. So he explains that, and by explaining that, he is indirectly explaining why my personal consciousness does not experience all the time the collective unconscious. So that explanation is more present in Jung than in Schopenhauer. The emphasis is also different. Schopenhauer's emphasis was purely the truth. What is true? How do I account for the world? Jung's emphasis was more clinical. It's not only
Hmm.
about what is true, is how do I use that to help people, to help my patients live a more meaningful, productive life with less suffering. So you have that distinction in emphasis. You have differences in influence as well. Uh, Jung's influences do overlap partly with Schopenhauer's because both Schopenhauer and Jung go back to Plato, for instance. Both go back to Kant, which was very recent for Schopenhauer, less so for Jung, but
Mhm.
both go to those two guys. But Jung has a range of other influences that Schopenhauer didn't have. For instance, Jung was
Hmm.
very influenced by the symbolism of alchemy and Neoplatonism. Schopenhauer wasn't. Jung was aware of Indian mythology, so Advaita Vedanta, for instance, Kashmiri Shaivism, but he was less influenced. Well, Jung was aware of those, but he emphasized the distinctions between the Western proclivities and these Eastern traditions. And he warned against Western minds pretending to be Eastern minds because that tradition was developed under different circumstances. And so he warned against that. Schopenhauer didn't. Schopenhauer acknowledges the direct relationship between his philosophy and Eastern philosophies in the Vedantic, in the Vedas, in the tradition of the Vedas, including the
Hmm.
Upanishads, which were ancient interpretations of the Vedas. So there are these differences in emphasis, in influence, in what they address more directly or less directly, or what they leave uncovered, but there is no contradiction between the two. And that's what you noticed, that they dovetail together very well.
And one thing I wanted to, well, this is pure speculation, but since you brought up Jung and well, we've talked about Jung a lot, but um, I did an explainer video on the Red Book a few years ago, and probably the most common comment I get about it is about the question of whether Jung ever took psychedelics or not. I'm not sure if you've uh, heard musings about it, but do you happen to have a take on that?
I don't think he took psychedelics.
Hmm.
At some point later in his life, he described himself as being someone for whom the walls were transparent.
Hmm.
And what he meant by that is that he had natural access to levels of the personal and the collective unconscious that most people don't, because our conscious mind sort of obfuscates that. The light of attention the glare of the light of attention is too high for us to discern, the shadows in the unconscious. For him, it was not difficult because the walls for him were transparent. He would have had access to nitrous oxide, laughing gas, um, which is not quite a psychedelic, but does weaken internal boundaries. But I do not think he actually used it.
Mm,
He was remarkably open-minded for his time. You know, he had, quote, two wives and wasn't
mhm,
ashamed of it, and he didn't give a damn about the conservative traditions of Switzerland. Switzerland to this day is an incredibly conservative country. I used to live there. I love
mm,
Switzerland, by the way. So my saying this is not a criticism. It's just an acknowledgement of how the country is. So I can't even imagine what it would have been like for Jung in the early 20th century to live like he did and to say the things he did. It would have been scandalous, and somehow he got away with it.
mm,
Um, but nonetheless, I do not think that despite being so open-minded and not caring about how he would be perceived by the society around him, I do not think he took psychedelics. I have read the Red Book several times. Um, it's right there with a
oh yeah.
brown cover. It's not red because I protected it, but it's the big book vertically positioned here.
Mhm,
Um, and I do not get the telltale signs of a psychedelic trance because
mm,
um, it is a consistent narrative. The characters keep on reappearing over the years.
mm,
You don't get that with
mm,
psychedelics. Every psychedelic
mhm,
trip stands to be completely, even incommensurable with previous trips. And at some point, they start cycling back, and that's the sign that your curriculum is over. There is no point anymore in doing more psychedelics. You know,
right,
yeah,
mm,
but the psychonauts amongst your audience will understand what I'm alluding
mm,
to. I do not see the telltale sign of a psychedelic experience because psychedelics, they are powerful, but the content of the experience is often very disorganized. There's a lot of noise. It
mm,
doesn't have the coherence over the years, over the experiences that you see in Jung. You know, the same characters return, and they tell a continuous story that evolves over time. And no, no, no. I
mm,
think he achieved those states very spontaneously because that's how he was put together. He had a natural predisposition to that. Since childhood, he was very prone to fantasizing. He
mm,
had amazing dreams as a 4 year old boy. Amazing dreams that entail literally adult content that he would have had no access to, no
right,
understanding of. So the walls were transparent for him from birth. So no, I do
mhm.
not think he used psychedelics. No.
Great. I have it straight from Bernardo. I'll timestamp this interview and get back to everybody because I had the same take, but I'm not a Jungian expert. So, um, have you ever experimented with? I'm not sure he ever called it hypnagogia, but to
Yeah,
translate that process, it's pretty similar, or maybe it's the same. But have you
yeah,
ever experimented with any of that before?
I did.
Mm,
N- Around the period in which I was studying psychedelics and therefore experimenting with psychedelics, I found it much easier to capture the subtleties and nuances that happen in my mind when I'm not paying attention. So I was much
mm,
more in state to sort of catch hypnagogic or hypnopompic imagery at play, capture that and remember. Because psychedelics have this long lasting effect that they make it easier to introspect into subtle corners and nuances of your inner life that normally it just goes over our heads. We just don't notice that, even though it's happening all the time. So at that time, I well, I paid attention. I keep coming back to this.
yeah, that's what it
Um,
is. Yeah.
Today, it doesn't happen anymore because I haven't done psychedelics in years, and I'm no longer capable. I don't have that sensitivity anymore. My brain has sort of rewired around my analytic mind, which is very overwhelming, and I'm very focused on the prefrontal cortex, and that's a kind of prison. And psychedelics sort of
Mhm.
weaken the bars a little bit. You know, the iron becomes more malleable, so you can sort of reach out a little bit. But now they are pretty hard again. And I don't
Mm,
feel the need to re-engage with psychedelics at this time.
mm.
It's just a feeling. If I feel, I will do it. So I'm not
Yeah,
saying this
sure.
out of some kind of rational decision or moral commitment. No, no, I don't. I don't have that. If I feel like doing it, I would do it again. But right
Yeah.
now, I'm pretty much in peace with not doing it again. Psychedelics have a tendency to give you what they need to give, and then saying, "This is it. Now you go live your life."
Mm,
They don't monopolize you. It for one, it's not pleasant. It's heavy stuff.
yeah.
It's difficult inner learning. So they naturally not only don't make you compelled to keep on returning, they do the opposite sometimes. They compel you at some point to conclude that this was it. That was
Mm,
it. I got out of it what I needed to get. Now on with the business of life, which has a limited time. I will be reassociated with the universal mind at some point anyway.
right.
No, but now that I'm in this state, I have to explore this state and not
Right.
spend my life trying to reassociate because that will happen anyway. One day I'm going to die anyway.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And I hope I'm not coming across. I'm not trying to put too much emphasis on the psychedelic question. It's a bit of, I mean, it's an interesting topic uh, to me. I think it's fascinating, and again, not that much experience with them, but the limited I do, I mean, I can understand why people find it profound, and there's uh, there's a lot there. But I am, I think, more inclined to, I guess, your perspective on it, that um, the knowledge, the memories of those experiences are almost enough.
Yeah.
It's like I don't want to push it too far. I don't
And,
need to risk it anymore. It's like, okay, I can remember. It's like that's
yeah.
yeah.
And it comes to a point as well where during the experience you're like, this is amazing, but there is no way I can bring this back with me. As soon as the
Mm,
trip ends, I will no longer understand or know what I know and understand right now. And you know it on the spot.
mm,
You cannot bring some of that stuff back.
mm,
It's beyond human conception, beyond language, beyond anything. So when you are there, you're like, wow. But there is
yeah,
something in your mind saying, there is no way I can take any of this with me. This understanding is going
yeah.
to evaporate the moment I become sober again. And when you
Mm,
start experiencing this several times in a row, to me, I acknowledge that for other people it can be a completely different thing, but to me, it was a sign, this is it. I am no
mm,
longer capable of taking anything back and enriching my life. This
mm,
just frustrates me because
yeah.
when I go back, I know that there is all this stuff that I can't access, can't bring back with me, and it just frustrates you. So I'm not
Mm,
going to keep on tempting myself with the unachievable. I just go on and live my life, and one day I will die, and then it will be there again. Then it's fine.
yeah. Oh, that's great. The Okay, so I do want to do. I want to do Schopenhauer some more justice because we focused, and I mean, it's focused a lot on Jung at the beginning, but I guess to put a bit of a sort of complete the book a bit here, and then I have a couple questions to ask you about Brief Peaks Beyond. The And actually in the description of this video, because there's so many great quotes from these books, and I can't just spout them all off now. But in the description of this video, if folks want a little bit more enticement to get into these books, I'll pull out some of my favorite quotes because there are some amazing ones. But one of which is, and I actually think this from Schopenhauer, and this is like the same idea that concludes with Jung, is he writes, to put it more directly, the metaphysical meaning of human life is to achieve metaconscious awareness of the dynamics of the will, which seems, I mean, that's
Same
exactly
thing Jung said.
what you're with. But the one thing I think the thing he adds, and maybe Jung would agree with this, but is the last work of intelligence is to abolish willing. True salvation lies in the denial of the will. Can you go into that?
In that segment, what he means is the personal will,
Okay.
because it is the notion of the personal self that leads the personal will to want the impossible and to not be satisfied with the workings of the world. It's only by thinking that we are not the world, um, that we become, that we get this sense of powerlessness and claustrophobia and not being enough to ourselves. Because in reality, we are the world, we are the will, but it's the limited personal will that falls from grace, that imposes self-torture because of its deluded notions of self, identity, purpose, meaning, and all that.
Mm.
So, if you want to be happy, then you have to overcome this deluded personal will and merge with the will at
Mm.
large, which is what you have always been and never cease to be. And his recipe for it is to allow the world to imprint itself so overwhelmingly on us that the personal self just disappears.
Mm.
That's
Okay,
what he
great.
means by the abolishment of the will. He means by
By
that
that
the
will.
abolishment of the personal
Mm.
will, because the
Mm.
will itself is all there is, and he's very clear about that. So it cannot be abolished, because if it were abolished, there would be nothing.
Mm. Mhm.
Existence would blink out of existence, which is not even something coherent to say. Nothingness cannot be imagined. So that's what we have to pay attention. Schopenhauer uses words in context. He can use the same word in very different meanings depending on context. And what informs you about what he means is always the context. So you cannot take one passage from one context, another passage from another, in which he uses the same words,
Okay.
and compare
Mm.
to one another, because then you will find contradictions all over the place, which is what the author of that little book I refer to is
Mhm.
precisely what he does. That's vulgar. That's
Mm.
anti-scholarly. It's just
Sure.
silly and
Yeah.
almost malicious. That's
Mm.
not how we have to read Schopenhauer. He writes as if he were standing in front of us and talking to us. And when we talk to other people, instead of writing, highbrow academic papers, um, we always use context. We always presuppose the context, and we assume that our interlocutor will understand what we are saying based on the current context. But analytic philosophers try to avoid that when they are writing analytic papers. They try to be conceptually very clear, and to define terms before usage and not count on context for their meanings to be understood, and to be consistent in the meaning they attribute to a given term. That's what analytic philosophers do. But analytic philosophy was born in the early 20th century with Russell, with
Mm.
Whitehead, with I'm drawing blanks here, but it began mainly with Russell in the early 20th century. It didn't exist when Schopenhauer was alive. So Schopenhauer doesn't follow those criteria. And to pretend that he does, in order to be able to accuse him of being an idiot who contradicts himself all over, is itself idiotic.
Mm.
It's just maliciously refusing to understand what's going on.
Mm. Yeah. I was wondering too about this is a little bit more on the Jungian side, but so we have the collective unconscious, we have the personal unconscious, ego conscious. Are there other levels? I mean, are ostensibly, is there something? Because what I think of is kind of stops there, and that's what we know about our the personal ego conscious is the thing we're most in tap with, tapped into, I should say. But maybe something above that, sort of like I don't know, the union, let's say, of two persons together. Like, are there levels above?
Not explicitly.
Mm.
Jung discusses the conjunctio, as he calls it, which is a concept from alchemy. That's the union of opposites, but it's not in the sense that you refer to, like
Mm.
people merging together in some kind of higher level consciousness. Like, is there something it is like to be China, as opposed to what it is like to be individual Chinese? No, Jung doesn't go in that
Mm.
direction. Not that I know what. He was the inspirer of a form of psychological therapy that involves groups.
Mm.
But I don't think he meant to suggest that there is group consciousness. Every time he talks about group consciousness, for instance, he talks about it when Nazism began to grow in Germany, which is a process he witnessed as an adult. He talks about group consciousness in that context, but what he means is not to go higher, but to go lower. What he means is that there is a collective manifestation of the collective unconscious that is going through nearly every German citizen at that time. So it's not like the individual consciousnesses of the Germans somehow combine together. No, it's that they already have a common foundation anyway. It's the collective unconscious. And that common foundation, at a certain moment in time, was reasserting itself against the individual ego. And that's why people were acting collectively, not because they joined, but because their common foundation was reasserting itself in a very
Mm,
skewed, dangerous way. So that's how he would deal with this collectivist aspect. It's not like you need to combine anything. You just go back to the level in which there is no separation to begin with. So you don't need to combine anything. Just go back to origins. There, everything is already together because it's oneness. It's the
mm.
collective unconscious.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that helps. Yeah, I understand that. I only have a few more minutes left, so I do want to get a couple, or maybe we'll just focus on one topic, I think, from Brief Peaks Beyond. And it's I guess a very much more practical in the world kind of idea. But on page, it was 150, you wrote, I'd love to sort of maybe end here, the around economic materialism. So very different, just so we get for folks listening, separating apart from, we talk about metaphysical materialism, we'll talk about say like resource allocation and consumerism, consumerist materialism. But you wrote, it is, which I thought was great, it is the very economic success of materialism that carries with it the seed of its own destruction. And um, and you talk for for a few pages about, and I think it's such a great to take down of our current materialistic consumer culture that we have. Can you explain that a little bit though? Like, what do you see? You make that statement, and you also said you can see signs of the paradigm changing, which I'd love to hear more
Yeah.
about.
I wrote that book 10 years ago. So since then, I probably have more nuance to my thinking in this regard. So what I would say now may not necessarily be exactly what you will find in
Oh
that
yeah.
book. Today, I would say it's beyond that. It's beyond there being just signs that the paradigm is changing. It is flat out changing. It's not a matter of reading the signs anymore. It's just happening. Just pay attention. Just pay attention to life, and you see that the changing process is well underway. It's very self-evident. The great champions of metaphysical materialism are losing their voices. They're becoming irrelevant. They started being looked down at because of their naivete and their commitment to things that are untenable. And you have others who are honest scholars who are publicly going through an advancement of their views, which betray the presence of this transition, not only in academia, but in the world at large. But of course, every time that there is a real process of transition, there is a reaction to that. It's almost like Newton's laws of motions, right? When something starts
Mm,
changing, there's a backlash to that. It's normal. It's how cultures change. It's how the cultural ethos changes. There is always a backlash. So we have that too. But it's not a strong counter movement. It's more like I would use the word. It's maybe the wrong word, but I will use it. It's almost a sign of desperation,
mm,
a desperate attempt to hold back to what defined one's sense of self and stand in the world, and you don't want to part with that. So the backlash comes from that, and it doesn't come across as informed really by reason and evidence. It comes across as emotionally triggered
mm,
and generally not really powerful as far as the cultural discourse is concerned. Now, the other point, so that's how my view evolved. I don't think it's a matter of signs anymore. Right? It's just the process happening, staring at us in the face. It's just there. Look, look. Just pay attention. Pay
Mm-hmm.
attention, you will see it happening. Regarding the economic success of materialism, so cultural materialism, like the material girl, Madonna the material girl, the needs to buy things, to project meaning onto things, it carries a seed of its own destruction because if you pursue that avenue to its conclusion, you will see inevitably that there was nothing there. What keeps people still wanting things is their inability to achieve those things. You only see that those things are ghosts. They don't do what you expect them to do once you achieve them. And then you run your fingers through them and you realize there's nothing here. It didn't do the thing. It didn't do the job. I'm still miserable, right?
Yep.
Which is the reason why a lot of rich and famous people, after they get rich and famous, they commit suicide or die of a careless drug overdose, which amounts to suicide. Um, it's the achievement of the false goals that betrays their falsity. It is not being able to achieve them that keeps them in existence. Why? Because we are making that stuff up. Things don't have the power we attribute to them. That power is in us. We project it onto them. Only by achieving them, we realize that they were empty. But for as long as we don't achieve that which we are looking for, which is in us, gets projected on the outside. And we believe that fantasy, so we keep on trying. But because this attempt is fundamentally futile, it can never really be fulfilling to anyone. That's why it carries the seed of its own destruction. Its very untenability to do what we expect of it is the seed of its destruction. Once we have knocked our heads against that wall enough times, eventually we realize that that's not the way to go. Let's rethink this. That's what I meant. That's what I would
Mm.
mean today by the seeds of its destruction being there. It doesn't work, neither rationally nor emotionally. It doesn't do its job in any way, metaphysically, culturally, psychologically. It just doesn't do it. It
Mm.
only does it temporarily for people who like to differentiate themselves based on that narrative. For the, you know, big mouthed, self-appointed spokespeople of science that you see on TV, who
Yeah.
think that they are distinguished because they are the rational, brave people who stare the hard facts in the face. They admit that life has no meaning, that everything is just material, that we are all going to die and then that's it. So that gives them a sense of personal differentiation. In psychology, this is called meaning compensation. You lost your source of transcendent meaning because you believe bullshit, and you compensate for that by emphasizing your distinction, your sense of self worth, of being better than the other idiots who are still praying to God. But even that is not working anymore.
Mm.
The social discourse, the cultural debate is now, um, it is not as, it has multiple centers now. It's
Mm.
not a simple fight, materialism versus religion. There are a lot more nuance now. Like idealism is not a religion. Idealism is realist, it's rationalist, it's reductionist even, but it's not materialism either. So you start having all these nuances, these new perspectives about the menu of alternatives on the table and their subtleties. Um, Once you start realizing, oh no, the sky has many stars. It's not just a binary option. The energy of the previous two dominant stars, religion and materialism, their energy is sucked away. The stars don't shine very bright anymore. It becomes a less sharp distinction, and social media amplifies that multipolarity as well.
Right.
So that no,
Mm.
materialism is a dead man walking. It's already
You,
dead. It just didn't fall to the ground yet. It's a
I
slow
like that.
fall.
Yeah, you already knocked it out. You just had to wait for it to fall. The but specifically with cultural materialism, so economic, do you see signs of that paradigm changing at all? And if not, how do we kick it out of its local minima?
And that's a different question because
Yeah.
now there is more entailed here than just the psychology of people.
Mm.
I think that if people are no longer fanatic consumerists, then the system would would become weakened for obvious reasons. We would be less driven to buy stuff we don't need. No, you don't need 2 dozen pairs of shoes. You don't need to change your car every year. You don't really need more than one house. You can always go to a hotel. You don't need new clothes. Fashion is bullshit. So there would be, you don't need a new iPhone. I'll show you my iPhone. This is my iPhone. It's an iPhone
Nice.
SE from 2016, and we are recording this in 2024. And
Yeah.
there is one reason I will change this iPhone early next year. It's because it's not reliable anymore.
Mm,
The battery doesn't last, and
mm,
sometimes it goes into a form of airplane mode without my setting it. So, okay, and I can't repair it because these things are made to not be repaired. I could have a workbench. I mean, I'm still a computer engineer. I have a workbench down there. I can repair a lot of stuff, but not new stuff. It's made to not be repaired. So once this dawns, the driving force behind materialist capitalism will reduce. But there are other dynamics, not just people's psychology. There's power dynamics. You know, how is power distributed in our society today? There is a scholar from Greece. I think he was a former member of the Greek government, finance minister, if I remember correctly. I forgot his name. But he writes about the technofeudalism being the emergent model in which very
mm,
rich people who made their money out of vast technological networks, like owners of social media or owners of devices, electronic devices, they start having power comparable to that of government. And we are seeing this even at the geopolitical level today. Certain individuals have the power to shift where the war in Ukraine goes, a power that is comparable to that of governments.
mm,
And you can argue, is this democratic? Because these people were not elected by popular vote. They are exercising state level powers without being elected. So that's a question to ask, which this Greek guy asks. Is this how we want to organize ourselves? That the state becomes a sort of feudal organization in which, yes, there are elected officials, but their power doesn't really have teeth.
mm,
Um, but that dynamics of power is always there, has always been there, probably will always be there. And that drive to power has there's reason to believe it will survive the drive to stuff. You know, even if you lose your drive to wanting the next stuff, your drive to power may remain intact. And these are big forces. So I don't know where capitalism is going. What I can share with you is some dynamics I see playing out. I mean, I just started an AI company. We're
mm,
building an AI chip, so I'm familiar with how those things are going, and I can extrapolate the trends, and I can see, for instance, that AI will replace a great many human jobs, and we see it as bad news, which betrays the inadequacy of the capitalist system. Because here we found a way to spare human beings from menial tasks. And now it's bad news. And it's really bad news under capitalism because if you don't have a job, you don't have an income and you can't live. Um, so these kinds of developments betray the weaknesses of the system. In any
mm,
sane society, what we would do is this: oh, there is a technology that can replace humans much more efficiently from menial tasks. Great, great. That increases our ability to do with life what we want, you know, to take responsibility for the meaning of our lives because we're not attached to menial tasks anymore. It increases our wealth because tasks are performed much more efficiently. Fantastic. This should be good news, right? How do we make it good news? Well, everybody has to have universal basic income. There's no escaping that. And why wouldn't we do that? Technology has advanced so much that we should reward ourselves for those advancements by giving ourselves the opportunity to live a different kind of life, not being just cogs in a machine, right? To living a philosophical life, a life of art, a life of culture, a life of creative expression, a life of philosophical inquiry, a life of religious devotion. I mean, it's amazing how we have made what is tremendously good news, we turned it into a problem because of the system we use. Can the system generally survive this? If it's reformed, it can. And reform will entail not only practical things like universal basic income, no questions asked. Everybody, including me and you, receives a universal basic income from the government. And the government pays that by taxing. That's how things can be maintained in a healthy, harmonious way at a collective level. But there are even cultural changes we need to make because a great many people today, given our materialist culture, not only in the metaphysical way, but also in the economic way, they derive their sense of self-worth from their work, the job they perform. So they are only valuable, they're only important insofar as they perform a certain job. So if machines now replace them, they lose their sense of self-worth, which is entirely unnecessary because their importance was never tied to the menial jobs they do anyway. That's not what they are here for. That's not nature's game. It was a delusion to begin with. But now we have to confront the delusion and we have to reassess what life means. One of the basic errors we make in our capitalist system is to mistake importance for value. Is to think that value and importance are the same thing. Let me give you an example. If you're a trash collector, you command relatively small value. Why? Because lots of people can be trash collectors. You're not rare. And the system is set in such a way that if you're not rare, if what you can deliver is not rare, then it doesn't command high value because you can be replaced fairly easily. That makes sense, I think. If everybody's earning enough to live a decent life, you can make distinctions of value. I think that's okay. That's a part of the system that is okay, so long as everybody has enough to have a dignified, decent life. What is not okay is to think that because the value that is attributed to your activity is low, then the importance of your activity is equally low. Same example. If there were no trash collectors, there would be no civilization. We wouldn't have gone to the moon. There would be no internet. There would be no AI, no mobile phones, no heated houses, no houses for that matter. We would have to be pastoralists, dropping our trash along the way as we move from place to place, looking for fruit and animals to hunt. And then people would say, oh, no, of course, that's nonsense. Because if all the trash collectors today would disappear, other people would collect trash. Well, then they would be trash collectors. And if they wouldn't be, you could say, well, but I could collect my own trash. Well, then you would be the trash collector. The point is, if there are no trash collectors, there is no civilization. So trash collection is just as important as Bernardo Kastrup's designs for his AI hardware. The value, economic value, is different.
Yeah.
The moral value or the importance is not. Arguably, we can have a civilization without AI, but we cannot have a civilization without trash collectors. My importance is less than that of the trash collector, less than that of the farmer, less than that of a carpenter. My importance is very limited, at least on short term. On long term, it may be higher because AI, goodness knows where AI is going to go. But right now, my importance is lower than that of a trash collector, although my value is higher than that of the trash collector. It's critical for us to make that distinction. And that requires a reform, not only of the economic system, but the cultural framework within which the system arises.
Well, thank you.
People
Yeah,
now say that I'm a communist. Wait for the
no,
comments
don't worry about
down
that.
below.
Leave it in the comments. No, we just I like that we were up in the not I wouldn't say in the clouds so much, but we got so grounded at the end of this discussion. And but that was very important. And well, thank you so much for sharing
And
that. And,
Carlos, even what's happening in politics today and the rise, well, more than the rise, now the dominance of populism and demagoguery, it rides on the failure to make this distinction,
mm,
because it is the people who suffer um, a lack of dignity because their importance is mistaken for their value. It is these people that are reacting to these dynamics in which they are put down. The liberal elites, by conflating value and importance, they are basically telling half of the population that they are valueless, that their importance less, sorry, that they are importance less, that they
right.
have no importance. In other words, that they have no dignity. And this half of the population has taken this for decades, and it's not taking it anymore. And because of that, we are now in extremely dangerous waters where populist demagogues are using these dynamics. They're like parasites on these legitimate dynamics to manipulate people in certain directions. If we hadn't made this confusion between importance and value and acted accordingly, then urban liberal elites would treat farmers with great respect and dignity, would treat the trash collectors with great respect and dignity, even though they would have higher salaries than the trash collector, which is okay as long, but it's just market dynamics, as long as we don't mistake that delta in value for a delta in importance and dignity. So this mistake may be the end of us as a civilization, because it's the carrier, it's the energy that is moving populist demagoguery to power.
Mm,
It's a tragedy.
yeah.
And who is guilty for this? Urban, educated, liberal elites. I have me, me, where the place where I was born and grew. It's my people, including me, who are responsible for this. Not out of maliciousness necessarily, but out of philosophical and psychological naivete and confusion,
Mm,
which doesn't excuse us, because the effect
right.
of this confusion is very real suffering for decades. And the others just can't take it anymore, which is fair.
Yeah. Understandable. I mean, mm. Well, Schopenhauer's pessimism comes back. The end of the discussion. By the way,
There
realism.
you go.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But well, thank you, Bernardo. I want to be respectful of your time. This was a wonderful conversation and many different paths we took. What can the audience expect from you in the coming months? What do you have a plan for next year?
Ooh, um, there is a book that's coming out next year. I mean, there is
Oh,
a book that has just come out, end of October 2024. It's called Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. So it's a sort of
mm,
a grand summary, very short, very straight to the point of analytic idealism. So if people don't want to read all these books, then that short book is the one to read. It's very short
mm-hmm.
and
I'll link to
cheap,
that.
and
Yeah.
it compresses everything in a no um, very few words that aren't necessarily necessary in there. It's really straight to the point. So that's the thing I'm trying to promote now. My book for next year will come out at the end of August 2025. It's already written, it's already produced, but you
Hmm.
know how the publishing world works. Once you publish the book, it very quickly it's old news. So they do all the marketing to brick and mortar shops and fighting for shelf space. They do all that before official publication. Otherwise, very quickly it becomes too late. So they are
Mm,
doing that right now, but it will come out at the end of August, and it's completely different from everything I ever wrote. It's about the diamond, the flow of the impersonal within the human mind, the meaning of life,
mm,
the Western mind, and all that stuff. It's called the diamond and the Western mind. So you can expect something completely different from me next year,
mm,
because I think my message around analytic idealism is solid. It's 12 books countless papers, PhD theses, countless interviews, essays
Wow.
published in multiple magazines. I think I've done my duty there. I want to now explore what life is like under idealism. You know,
Hmm. Cool.
assume
Wow.
we
I can't
made
wait.
that transition, and now what?
Yeah.
Now we are
Yeah.
under idealism. And now what? How do we go about
Yeah.
it? That's where I want to focus now.
How exciting. I can't wait to see that. I'll be on the lookout for that in August. And I'll link in the description of this video to Analytical Idealism in a Nutshell and the three books that we covered. And I also want to plug too, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I really enjoyed your story time series on YouTube.
Oh yeah, it's very old.
Yeah,
It's
it's very
12,
old.
12 years old. Yeah.
Yeah, it's experimental, but it's a little bit out. You mentioned this next, the book coming out in August will be a little different. And that's very different from a lot of the stuff that you publish. So I'll link that too, because I don't think it gets enough love. But I really loved it. Yeah. So I'll share that too with the audience. And I just want to say thank you again. This is a wonderful conversation. I really, really liked it.
Thanks for having me, and I enjoyed it very much as well.
Thank you.